Hello children. Today we will discuss part 2 of the chapter Socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution. Before going to this part of the chapter, we will go back to what we studied in the last class just to refresh our memories. In the last class, we discussed about the age of social change and the varying ideologies of the liberals, the radicals and the conservatives. How they differed in their ideas relating to individual property, about granting suffrage to all, and how the conservatives were slow in accepting change. Then we also discussed about the impact of the Industrial Revolution, how new industrial regions came up which had a great impact on the life of the people at that time. With industrialization came the ideas of socialism, and gradually socialism started gaining support to coordinate the efforts of socialists worldwide. Even international organizations began to be formed. This is what we had studied about in the last class. As we move on today, we will know more about the Tsar, who was the monarch of Russia, how he ruled Russia, what were the political, social and economic conditions in Russia, and how this very idea of socialism was able to bring about a revolution in Russia. So, what is this Russian Revolution about? The Russian Revolution is the fall of the monarchy in February 1917 and the seizure of power by the socialists who took over the government of Russia through the October Revolution of 1917. So all this together is what we refer to as the Russian Revolution. At that time, Tsar Nicholas II was the monarch of Russia. He was an autocrat and never wished that his power should be questioned. Under Tsar Nicholas II, the Russian Empire was a huge empire. It consisted of today's Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Lithuania. So we see from this map of Russia under the Tsar, it was a huge empire with a variety of people. The major religions that were followed in Russia at this time were the Russian Orthodox Christianity, which was a sect which had branched out of the Greek Orthodox Church, but at the same time there were also Catholics, Protestants, Muslims and Buddhists living in Russia. Then we will further proceed to know about the economy and society under Tsar Nicholas II. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian economy was basically an agrarian economy. That is, about 85% of the population earned their livelihood from agriculture. The cultivators not only produced food for their own needs, but also Russia at that time was a major exporter of grain. Compared to the other European countries like Germany and France, the proportion of peasantry was much higher in Russia. At that time, the proportion in Germany and France was roughly 40 to 50%, but in Russia, more than 80% earned their livelihood from agriculture. At that time, it was the time of the Industrial Revolution and the growth of industries. But this Industrial Revolution and coming up of industries was not even and uniform. In Russia, industries were found in pockets. So, the major industrial areas were St. Petersburg and Moscow. At that time, goods were also produced by craftsmen in the workshops, and as the new industries came up, factories as well as craft workshops existed and worked side by side. In the 90s, this growth in the industrial sector began to expand, and a variety of factors can be attributed to this. The first being the expansion of the railway network. As we all know, the railways not only bring in raw materials for the industries but also transport finished material from the area of production to the area of consumption. At that time, there was also foreign investment in the industries, and all this resulted in the coal production being doubled and the iron and steel output which quadrupled during the 1890s. But what about the people who worked in these industries? At that time, these industries were private enterprises. They were owned by individuals or small group of individuals who wanted to maximize on the profit that they got from these industries. So, the labor force who worked in these industries spent very long hours working there. In the small workshops, the working hours were around 15 hours and 10 to 12 hours in the factories. Although the government had put forth regulations regarding minimum wages and the limited hours of work, but very often these rules were broken. Supervisors and inspectors did do their job, but in spite of it, rules were broken and people worked for more than the hours they were scheduled to. It was not only their working conditions but also their living conditions were extremely poor. Accommodation was not good. They slept in the bunkers and very often they had to leave their families behind and come and stay in their place of work. Here again we see that the workers were divided into social groups. There were the workers of the metal industries, the workers who worked in the textile mills, and the women. Among them, the metal workers considered themselves as the aristocrats. Why was it so? The metal industry workers were trained, were skilled, and that is why they thought that their job was special. The women who comprised of 31% of the factory workforce were not as well paid as their male counterparts. The divisions among these workers was reflected in their dress and their manners. Slowly, the workers started forming their associations in order to help the members during the times of crisis. They set up funds so that people could borrow money from them when they lost their jobs or when they were in dire need of money. But we see that although the workers were divided as a social group, When it came to protests and strikes, they were a big united group. So, strikes became common. A time came when they started voicing their views about their conditions of work as well as their living conditions. In 1896-97, there were frequent strikes in the textile industry, and by the time it was the early 1900s, similar strikes started taking place in the metal industry as well. Now, we move on to the peasantry who worked in the countryside. The peasantry, who formed about more than 80% of the total population, worked in the countryside, in the lands which were rarely theirs. Very few peasants had their own lands, and they cultivated in the lands that belonged to the nobility. At that time in Russia, most of the land was owned by the nobility, the crown, and the Orthodox Church. The peasants cultivated the land in the countryside, but they had no respect for the nobility. They wanted that the land of the nobles should be transferred to the peasants. They felt that the nobles, only by serving the Tsar, enjoyed a lot of privileges that they were really not entitled to. So, the peasants were against the nobles. They refused to pay rents, murdered the landlords, and as time passed, such violent incidents became very common in the countryside. Here we see that the peasants were different from the other peasants in Europe. For example, when we studied about the French Revolution, we had discussed that sometimes the peasants even worked in the armies of the nobles during the revolutionary wars. But here in Russia, it was not so. The peasants here worked differently too. They pooled their land periodically. They worked together, and whatever profit they got from the land that they cultivated was divided according to the needs of the family, and this was done by their commune. So, this idea of dividing the profits among all those people who contributed to the making of the profit actually made the peasants natural socialists. And we will know later that it was some of the organizations then who fought for the peasants' rights and wanted that the peasants should be the driving force behind the Russian Revolution. Before 1914, political parties were illegal in Russia. The socialists who supported Marxist ideas founded the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party in 1898, which operated as an illegal organization. The socialists considered the Russian peasants to be natural socialists and felt that they should be the people who should be the main force of the revolution. In 1900, the Socialist Revolutionary Party was formed, which mainly fought for the rights of the peasants. They demanded that the land of the nobles should be transferred to the names of the peasants. At this time, we see the emergence of Lenin as a leader. According to Lenin, the peasants were not one united group. Among the peasants, there were rich and there were poor. So, it was not possible for all of them to be a part of a socialist movement. He led the Bolshevik group, which was disciplined and had limited number and quality of membership. So, the membership of the Bolshevik Party was not open to everyone. Then we come to turbulence in Russia, the 1905 revolution, which was in reality a prelude for bigger things to come. We already know that Russia was an autocracy. The Tsar was not subject to parliament. He did not want to be questioned. At that time, the liberals, the social democrats, and the socialist revolutionaries mobilized the support of the peasants and the workers and demanded a constitution for Russia. They were supported by other nationalists and jihadists. So, who were the jihadists here? They were the Muslim reformers who lived in Russia. So, all of them together looked forward to a constitution which would limit the powers of the monarch. In the pre-revolutionary stage, we see that Russia was passing through an economically difficult phase. In the 1904, the prices rose. The prices of essential commodities rose. Real wages declined. Real wages declined by 20%. This means the purchasing power of the money that people received as wages began to decline. So, there was a growth in membership in the workers' associations as they faced difficult times. 4 workers were dismissed at the Putilov Iron Works. This was a clarion call for the workers of other industries to unite and call for industrial action. 10,000 workers joined in the strike and they marched to St. Petersburg demanding better wages, better working conditions and reduced working hours. Here they were led by Father Gapon to the Winter Palace where Tsar Nicholas II lived. As they marched, the police and the Cossacks opened fire. Over 100 workers were killed and 300 wounded by the police. This incident is remembered in history as the Bloody Sunday incident of 1905. So, things did not stop here. This was the beginning. This led to strikes all over Russia. Universities closed, students staged walkouts and complained that civil liberties were under threat. Lawyers, doctors, engineers, middle class workers established associations like the Union of Unions. All this was an alarm to the Tsarist government. So, the Tsar decided to change his stance. He allowed the creation of an elected consultative parliament or the Duma. Factory committees and unions were declared illegal and there was restrictions placed on political activity. The Tsar dismissed the first Duma within 75 days, re-elected the second Duma within 3 months, changed the voting laws, and the third Duma was packed with conservatives who would not do anything that the Tsar did not approve of, because the Tsar wanted that his rule should be absolute. There should be no questioning of his authority. As it was time now for World War I, and the two European alliances began to build their armies to face each other. In this map, we see that the Russian Empire, UK, France, they fought the war with Austria-Hungary, the German Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. What was the result of the war? Was Russia's involvement in the war good for the country? In the beginning, the people supported the Tsar, but as the war continued and the Tsar refused to consult the Duma, the support that he enjoyed began to become lesser and lesser. Anti-German sentiments ran high. St. Petersburg was renamed as Petrograd. Tsarina Alexandra's German origin, the presence of her advisor Rasputin, all this made the autocracy unpopular. Let us see what was happening at the war front. The defeats were shocking and demoralizing. During the period 1914 to 1917, the Russian army, fighting from the trenches, losing badly in Germany and Austria, was extremely demotivating for the Russians. By 1917, the number of casualties touched 7 million. The enthusiasm of the Russian army began to slowly lessen. The soldiers now were tired of fighting a war which seemed to go on endlessly. As the army retreated, they destroyed the crops and buildings so that the enemy would not hide there and would not live off the land. This destroying of crops, of houses of the people, created 3 million refugees in Russia who were rendered homeless, without livelihood and without food. This situation discredited the Tsar, and slowly the Tsarist power collapsed. Nevertheless, the World War I had not only led to the collapse of the power of the monarch, but it had a terrible impact on the economy and the industry of Russia. There was a severe impact on Russian industries. Russia was cut off from other suppliers of industrial goods because the Baltic Sea was now controlled by Germany. Industrial equipment started disintegrating because they were out of use. Railway lines began to break down. All able-bodied men were forcibly recruited to the army, leading to a shortage of labor, and this eventually led to the workshops and the industries shutting down because there were no people available to work in these places. Large supplies of grain were sent to feed the army. This resulted in scarcity of bread and flour in the cities. And in 1916, when the winter was harsh, there were queues and riots at the bread shops. This was the condition of France in the post-World War I period. So, in this chapter, We discussed about the Russian Empire in 1914 and the rule of the autocratic Tsar, how the economy and society of Russia was organized, how the concept of socialism began to gain popularity, and eventually how the 1905 revolution took place as a prelude to the 1917 revolution, and Russia's involvement in World War I and the impact of World War I on Russia. Let us now have a quick question-answer session on what we have studied today. What was the major religion of Russia? Russian Orthodox Christianity. What was the main means of livelihood for the vast majority of Russians? It was agriculture. Name the prominent industrial areas of Russia. St. Petersburg and Moscow were the important industrial regions of Moscow at that time. Name the party founded by the Socialists of Russia in 1898. The Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. When was the Socialist Revolutionary Party formed and what were its demands? The Socialist Revolutionary Party was formed in 1900. This organization struggled for peasants' rights and demanded that the land of the nobles should be given to the peasants. Who were the Jihadists? The Jihadists were the Muslim reformers within the Russian Empire. Who led the procession of workers to the Winter Palace? It was Father Gapon. What was the new name of St. Petersburg? St. Petersburg was renamed as Petrograd. Which countries were the central powers during World War I? Germany, Austria and Turkey were the central powers during World War I. We have come to the end of today's class. In the next class, we will discuss about the February and the October Revolution of 1917. Thank you.